Just moments ago, Mexico's president said they have reached a deal to pause those new U.S. tariffs by a month. Let's go back to NBC's Gabe Gutierrez at the White House. Our Brian Chung's also still with us here on set. Gabe, what more can you tell us?
Hi there, Anna. Well, these are very fast-moving developments, and also we just heard from the president within the past few moments on social media as well. But first to the social media posting from the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum. She just said that Mexico will send 10,000 members of its National Guard to its border with the United States to prevent the flow of fentanyl into the U.S. The Mexican president also said that the U.S. will work to prevent arms trafficking into Mexico, and as a result, they are pausing tariffs for 1 month. Now, President Trump, within the past few moments, he posted on social media saying, confirming all of that, but also saying that there will be negotiations over the next month involving Secretary of State Marco Rubio and other high-level officials from the United States with high-level representatives from Mexico. The president says he looks forward to participating in those negotiations with President Sheinbaum as we attempt to achieve, quote, a deal between our two countries. So again, on the breaking news that these tariffs, at least with Mexico, have been paused for 1 month. But we should point out that the president, as late as Friday, had said that nothing could stop these tariffs from going into effect. So it appears we're seeing a real-time negotiation here between these top allies. And the president saying that he spoke with Mexico's president just this morning. Now, the question becomes, Anna, what will happen to Canada? President Trump said that he spoke with Prime Minister Trudeau just this morning, and he plans to speak with him again at 3 p.m. this afternoon. So there remains a real possibility we could see these tariffs avoided, at least in the short term, before they take effect at midnight tonight. But again, that's sizable news that is sure to have impact on financial markets, that these tariffs have been delayed at least for a month with regards to Mexico, Anna.
We term a little pain, and people understand that. But long term, the United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world. We have deficits with almost every country, not every country, but almost. And we're going to change it. It's been unfair.
Little pain. This might mean a $12 omelet. Begins when the clock strikes midnight, with the Wall Street Journal identified as, quote, the dumbest trade war in history. We are officially in wag the dog territory, folks. A 25% tariff on nearly all goods coming into the U.S. from Canada, an additional 10% on all Chinese imports. Earlier today, Donald Trump said the U.S. and Mexico reached an agreement to delay the promised tariffs on goods from Mexico. A 1-month delay in exchange for increased security at the border. But still, and yet, the American people who told us that the cost of food and groceries were the most important issue by a mile in their selection of Donald Trump over Kamala Harris in the November election, they stand to pay a fortune, more than $1,000 extra on items, on groceries, items like avocados, tomatoes, strawberries, beer, tequila. And who doesn't need tequila these days? Maple syrup, cars, trucks, gas, consumer electronics, phones, iPads, all that stuff. Lumber, you're doing a renovation or building a new fence, on and on and on, affecting every aspect of an American family's everyday life. Joining our conversation, NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor and NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Christine, why?
Well, before the why, I guess the breaking news is that Justin Trudeau from Canada just tweeted that there will be a 30-day pause on those Canadian tariffs. So Mexico got a pause earlier today. So this is sort of how this is going to go. The why is the big mystery. Donald Trump says that the U.S. is taken advantage of. The U.S. is bullied by these much smaller countries like Canada with 37 million people, and that the U.S. can't sell its products all over the world, but we take in everything. So there's just this sense of an aggrieved President Trump. There are certain.
Does Canada bully us?
Canada sells us a lot of stuff, and we sell Canada a lot of stuff. It's one of our closest trading partners.
Mm-hmm.
If you look, Trump is basically threatening a trade war with Canada, China, and Mexico, by far the 3 biggest countries that send us stuff. a lot of stuff, $1.2 trillion of stuff just in the 11 months, the first 11 months of last year. All of those things, if these tariffs go into effect, would cost more money. And we know that it is mostly its importers and its consumers who bear that cost.
You mean when Trump says, a little pain, this is a guy who downplayed the impacts of COVID. I mean, when he's at a little pain, I wonder what they're really worried about.
Well, what's really striking, because we all know that President Trump campaigned on this message and this promise of lowering costs for everyday Americans. It's something that I heard over and over again on the campaign trail from voters, whether they were voting for President Trump, frankly, or Vice President Harris. The message was that they were very worried about cost of living. But to hear President Trump say that there may be some pain, but that cost of pain will all be worth it down the line, I think was him trying to hedge and prepare the American people for prices going up on everything from avocados coming from Mexico, beer coming from Mexico, lumber, of course, the people trying to buy new homes or build new homes. So this was going to be something that he knew was going to hit the consumers, much like experts, including, of course, Christine Romans and all her great sources tell us when you talk about tariffs. I think I want to go back, though, to this, what Justin Trudeau just posted online, because I think it is striking to hear now that there's going to be this pause, 30-day pause on tariffs to Canada, much like we heard from Mexico earlier today. And Canada is basically saying it's going to roll out new border security measures, which really does go to what President Trump said he wanted out of Canada. I want to read part of it. It says that Canada is making new commitments to appoint a fentanyl czar. They're going to also list cartels as terrorist groups, ensure 24-hour eyes on the border, launch a Canada-U.S. strike force to combat organized crime, fentanyl and money laundering. And they also said he signed a new intelligence directive on organized crime and fentanyl, and they'll be backing with $200 million. He also said he's going to be sending, or at least having, nearly 10,000 frontline personnel. It's not clear if those are going to be new troops, but we know in Mexico they're going to be sending an additional 10,000 Mexican National Guard troops to the border. So despite what people might have, and I know there are a lot of critics, of course, of this Trump tariffs that came out, there is now Mexico and Canada saying that they're going to, as a result of these tariffs and as a response to these tariffs and conversations with President Trump, they're going to be beefing up their border securities. Well,
Yamiche, let me just put up how much fentanyl actually comes from the northern and southern border. At the southern border, 21,000 pounds of fentanyl. At the northern border, 43.43, which is bad, right? We don't want any fentanyl here. But let me just say, what the Trump narrative would have you believe is that the only way to have the nations of Mexico and Canada cooperate with the scourge of fentanyl is to threaten a globally disastrous trade war that damages the world's economies. Is there any contemplation that perhaps next time we'll have a meeting about dealing with fentanyl?
Well, it's going to be really interesting to see, because President Trump might walk around and really do a victory lap here, saying that he got Canada and Mexico to do what he wanted them to do. But we saw with the stock markets, we saw with even Republicans like Senator Chuck Grassley, who was asking for an exemption for his state for some of the items that would have really cost his constituents money. There was panic, real panic happening, including in the Republican Party, if this tariff war were to actually happen and this trade war were to actually happen with our closest allies. Let's remember, Canada and Mexico are our largest trading partners. So there's a real issue there. But President Trump is leaning in on this idea of using tariffs as a diplomatic tool. And as you said, Canada says that they're less than 1% or about 1% of the fentanyl that comes into the United States comes through Canadian borders. But even as they're saying that, saying fentanyl doesn't come through, here's Justin Trudeau saying, well, I'm going to have a new fentanyl czar. So it tells you that maybe some of this is him just wanting to placate President Trump and saying, I'm going to do this. But this is him saying, look, we're going to do what you want, which is have new people, have new resources going to the border with the United States. Nicole.
Let me show you Mitch McConnell taking to 60 Minutes to argue, I guess, against Trump doing this.
It will drive the cost of everything up. In other words, it'll be paid for by American consumers. I mean, why would you want to get in a fight with your allies over this?
I guess, Yamiche, even Mitch McConnell didn't understand the strategy. And I totally appreciate cracking down on fentanyl imports from the northern and southern border. But even Mitch McConnell wasn't in on the threat of a trade war as a pathway to fighting fentanyl.
That's right. It was striking to hear former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, someone who's had a long history leading Republicans. But let's remember, this is no longer really the Republican Party of Mitch McConnell anymore. This is a Republican Party where Mitch McConnell is one of the only Republican, or one of 3 Republican senators who went out on a limb just to vote against Pete Hegseth. But that nomination still went through. So it tells you a little bit about, yes, Mitch McConnell still has a voice. He's still someone who, of course, has a legacy within the Republican Party. Arguably, you would say the Supreme Court couldn't have been this 6-3 majority without Mitch McConnell. But there is a sense that Mitch McConnell, the Trump White House and Trump himself is listening really to what Mitch McConnell says. But I think Chuck Grassley, one of the senators, asking for an exemption for his state, to me, it was an insight into the fact that Republicans were really worried that their constituents were going to wake up and have a lot more cost of living, and that they were going to go to the grocery store and see $15 for eggs and other things that were going to really make life harder for Americans. So I think this really, in some ways, underscores that people were very worried about the prices going up in this country, Nicole.
So, Rev, we also have some breaking news this morning. We talked earlier in the show about USAID, its uncertain fate. We've just confirmed an email went out early this morning to staff saying, do not come in. Headquarters will be closed this morning. You are to work remotely. And Elon Musk is saying in his spaces last night, said that Donald Trump agreed with him to shut down the entire agency. Congress should have a say in there. They've been mute so far. Give us your reaction, though, as we know what good, both strategically and in terms of humanitarian terms, this agency does. Today, it's not open.
Strategically, it is very detrimental to the interests of the country because this aid that we do humanitarian-wise is also goes hand in glove with protecting and securing Americans and the United States, because we need people to see us as a humanitarian country as we try to deal with the fact that China and Russia are making inroads into Africa and other places. To just abruptly cut this off and to in essence get rid of or terminate those that have been doing that work is, in my opinion, not only a misjudgment, it's a cold, calculated play that I don't understand how it serves the interests of the American people. So at one level, you sympathize with those that work at USA, but at another level is, to what end are we saying we're going to cut this off? There's been no problems with them. There's been no questions about their service. So what is the point here?
But Jonathan, can we remind our audience, you said Elon Musk's directive. Elon Musk is a private citizen. He was not elected. He's not appointed. He has not had a background check. He has not been vetted in any way. OK, this is a private citizen that the president signed an executive order. Right. He even put Doge in parentheses. This isn't real. But Elon Musk and his team have now been given access to start to take over and control established government offices, right? When you talk about protecting U.S. interests, who's protecting U.S. interests? Elon Musk has always argued, I go to where the problem is. Well, who are you looking to solve it for? Right. Yourself and your personal interests, or the American people? We have tons of waste in this country. Let's do it. But why aren't the people who are doing it, why haven't they been confirmed? Why don't they have background checks? If they're going to shake things up, let's do it. But let's do it with some level of transparency.
Yep. Well, and again, as somebody that has literally focused my entire adult life on the national debt, which is at $36 trillion, it's supposed to go up another $20 trillion over the next decade, and understands and has been warning for 30 years now about the debt bomb that will go off, and when it goes off, it'll be bad. I would be the first to talk about the need to get spending under control, but you do it constitutionally. And by the way, going after U.S. aid, this is so preposterous. It's less than 1% of the federal budget. So, John Heilemann, though, you look, following up on what Stephanie just said, and looking at the hatred again, the hatred spewed this weekend from the world's richest man for the United States actually helping the poorest people across the globe, the most destitute people across the globe, and not just because we're good people, but because, as I've said before, Harry Truman made the calculation after World War II and Europe was in ruins. I have to get Herbert Hoover over there, and he needs to organize a humanitarian response, because if we don't do that, the communists will, and they will take over Western Europe as well. They understood that. Now we have China, we have ISIS, we have Al-Qaeda trying to make their way through and establish foothold all across Africa, all across the Southern Hemisphere. And you have, again, somebody who's not even a government employee basically kicking down the door of the Treasury Department this weekend, kicking down the door of USAID this weekend, sending his people in to have access to classified material that they have no right to have access to that classified material. And it appears to just keep going. And you do wonder, when are the Republican heads of these committees going to step forward and say, can't do that? That's actually my jurisdiction. Get out.
It's a very good question, Joe. And I would say there are a lot of things all built into that question and into the setup here. I mean, there is the Elon Musk of it all, which is, has been one of the most important stories of this new term. The notion, it's not a good look, obviously, in some sense. You wouldn't have thought the world's richest man campaigning to take out USAID in the way that he has been. But you look at we don't have a head of the FAA right now, because the prior head of the FAA decided to step down because Elon Musk was attacking him over things that and demanding his resignation. He is, as Stephanie said, this is not even just a question about transparency. It's a question about accountability. There is no such thing as the Department of Government Efficiency. It does not exist. It has not been created. It is now the head of it, the head of a fictional organization is now shutting down a long-established and congressionally authorized institution that has the history that you just said with USAID. But your question at the end is the crucial question. If you add up everything that Donald Trump has done since he took office, it amounts to a strategy of subjugating the legislative branch, whether it is the firing of the inspectors general, the purge at the FBI, shutting down the USAID, the discussions about buyout offers for federal employees. You could make a list of 30 things. All of them are about expanding the executive power and essentially saying to Congress, we dare you to assert your institutional prerogative to rein this in, and daring the courts to stop it. And your question, when will committee chairs? I'm not sure they ever will, because one of the questions that's at hand right now is, does Congress want to have its institutional prerogative? Does this Republican Party in the United States Senate and House want to be about a check and balance against the executive, or does it actually want to be, politically and otherwise, subjugated to Donald Trump's agenda? That question is, to a large extent, along with the question of whether the courts will intervene and what will happen if they do, those are like the whole ball of wax here.
All I'll say is this, Mika, is again, everything that happens now, as Jim Vandehei and Mike Allen wrote this morning in Axios, everything that happens in 2025 with a Republican president could happen in 2029 with a Democratic president. I think more to the point, though, when there are all these strategic missteps, when there is the gutting of USAID, an organization, again, that helps us actually collect data on Al-Qaeda, whether it's in the Ivory Coast or across the world. We actually collect data on Al-Qaeda through USAID. We actually get sources on Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others, China, trying to make moves across Africa. There will be blowback. And when that comes, those Republican senators that are sitting back letting this happen will be responsible. It's the same thing, actually, when you look at what's happening at the FBI. Internal purges are going on at the FBI right now. And that's great news for Al-Qaeda. That's great news for ISIS. That's great news to fentanyl drug gangs. That's great news to China. Spies for China, spies for Russia, spies for Iran. That is great news for our enemies. There's no way two ways cut it. Every Republican senator knows this to be the case. Every Republican House member knows this to be the case. If you are focusing your attention on purges at the Pentagon and purges at the FBI, then your enemies are the ones, your foreign enemies are the ones who are celebrating because they're getting more powerful because you're taking your eyes off the ball. And by the way, let me be the first to say, and I've said it, reform at the FBI, reform at the Pentagon, reform at USAID, reform across the government. A great idea. But, you know, one of Elon Musk's close associates said his goal and the goal of other billionaires that are involved in this are to strip the government down to its stubs.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of a handful of Republican senators that we have known all over the years that we've met with. Barrasso, Thune, Lindsey Graham, Dave McCormick, Susan Collins. I mean, they know this. They absolutely know this.
Everyone.
100%.
Every last one of them knows this is dangerous. A purge at the FBI is dangerous. If somebody stepped over the line, then yes, deal with those people accordingly. But a wholesale purge there, a wholesale purge at USAID, as John Lemire just said this morning, telling every USAID worker to stay at home. There are ramifications. Hard power, soft power, investigative power. Our enemies are loving this.
Still,
if you are suddenly taking out the most experienced folks at Justice or at the FBI, how does that make us stronger? And what he's saying is every FBI agent that somehow touched the January 6th investigation, that was a comprehensive investigation. I've been told there were almost half of all the FBI agents at least had some involvement. Remember, this was a case that was taken up against these rioters all across the country. If you're suddenly going to get rid of all of those, that could be thousands.
Yeah.
What does that mean for our cybersecurity? What does it mean for our trafficking and stop against fentanyl and other drugs? What does it mean in terms of, serious crime investigations? This would be devastating.
Frank Figliuzzi, the textbook definition of the decapitation of an agency is to remove all of its leaders. Chris Wray resigned and Patel isn't confirmed. Is the FBI right now functionally decapitated?
Yeah, every single executive assistant director is gone. Yes. And so, it's funny what's happening now. There's always been this tension between headquarters and the field, right? And there are certain career seasoned, grizzled agents who say, I'll never serve at headquarters. I don't want that. I don't need them. Well, guess what? Now here's the possibility of 5,000 or 6,000 FBI agents in the field being dismissed for simply doing their job and doing it well enough to convict 1,500 people who breached the Capitol and assaulted police officers. Now there's a wake-up call, right? And everybody is one. If Donald Trump wanted to just totally disrupt the FBI and totally prevent them from doing their mission, he has united them. When you have the head of the biggest office in the country, New York, saying, we're digging in, we're in a fight now, the acting director, who, by the way, was a hostage rescue team commander, you don't mess with him. He kicks indoors for a living. And so they've got this all wrong. And this is an agency where, you know what agents did in the last few weeks? Just the last few weeks, they captured 2 top 10 fugitives. That's never happened before. In just about a week, they did that. They were at the bottom of the Potomac River looking for parts in the D.C. air crash. They were in Philadelphia for that medevac plane crash. They were picking up bits and pieces of evidence in Bourbon Street in New Orleans on New Year's Day. That's what they do on top of losing some homes. FBI employees have lost their homes to fire in California in just the last 30 days. And this now comes to them? Not right.
I guess the reason I like to understand where we are at the moment we're on the air is because it ends up mattering, right? So on January 6th, it's not clear that Trump was functioning as the commander-in-chief, right? We've learned since that it's Pence that's on the phone with the Pentagon ultimately. And right now, with Christopher Wray's resignation, the firing of all top FBI leadership, and Mr. Patel not confirmed, do you agree with Frank's assessment that functionally the FBI is decapitated?
I agree with that. What's not decapitated and what you're seeing is the next level of leadership.
If they're allowed to rise, right?
Well, what I'm saying is the ones who are there now are obeying the law and the facts. And what you're seeing is FBI training, which is we take an oath to the Constitution. You're right that that leadership level has been taken out. In my view, totally illegal, violates the civil service rules and the protections of them. There was no process, there was no cause. If it happens again, same thing. You need cause to remove those people. I want to make sure people understand, I'm old enough to remember the Saturday Night Massacre. And I want people to understand, you might be thinking this is a story just about the FBI. It is not. It is enough that it's about the FBI, but I want to make people understand it is far more egregious than what Nixon tried to do by just removing the special counsel to say, I shouldn't be investigated. This is saying, I am a king. I can disobey all civil service rules. He has the number 2 at the Justice Department agreeing. So this is unlike what happened in the Saturday Night Massacre, where the Justice Department was saying, fire me because I'm not doing something that's illegal. Here, where you're seeing that pushback, that allegiance to the Constitution and to the American people, is that next layer
in the
of
field office.
In the field offices around the country. Those people are doing their duty to their oath of office, to the Constitution. It's hard to see this as anything more than like playing out a morality play of like pure patriotism against lawlessness on the part of the Justice Department.
I guess the disconnect, though, is every one of the FBI field offices is led by a special agent in charge, and every one of those field offices is in a state where they have 2 senators. Where is the legislative branch?
The legislative branch needs to obviously wake up, and it's not just out of loyalty to the FBI. It's out of any sense of their own oaths of office. We talked about this when we had Cassidy Hutchinson obeying her obligation to the rule of law, and we were saying she showed more gumption than a whole host of other people. I would hope that Lisa Murkowski, Senator Murkowski, could take what she is seeing at the FBI to convince her colleagues to do the right thing. And one of the right things to do, of many, is to make sure that they ask Pam Bondi and Kash Patel the question that you just asked. About where are they and what are they going to do about this? They have not been asked that. Everything that we've seen over the weekend is new. Kash Patel gave pretty inconsistent description of his position. They need to be under oath answering this. It is going to be. It'll show complete complicity if there aren't 4 Republican senators to go along with at least. Having a real as opposed to a sort of puppet show of a confirmation hearing. It's just amazing in the 24 years since 9/11 that you've got Republicans totally AWOL on domestic terrorism, foreign terrorism, homeland security. Glenn Thrush, I raised the question about a plot because one of the things we learned after January 6th is that it was the Norfolk field office that had some chatter about white supremacist groups. And it's Donald Trump's last handpicked FBI director who replaced Comey after he fired him, who testified under oath in 2020 that by far the biggest threat to the country is domestic violent extremism. And in the bucket of domestic violent extremism, by far the biggest threat is white supremacist violent extremism. What is the impact on pursuing what Christopher Wray, long associated with conservative politics, described as the gravest threat in a bureau that's been chilled
to your point, irreparably.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I can't speak for the volition of individual agents who could act responsibly, but there appears to be from the top, and you know, again, this emanates from the White House. One of the first executive orders the president signed was on DEI, and he appeared willing to shut down the entire government. You know, sort of a self-inflicted government shutdown with the OMB memo based on DEI stuff. But I think, you know, the point that folks are making about the agents sort of rising up, this is a really fundamental political point. Let's just switch over to the political argument here, right? Trump ran on law and order. During Bondi's hearing, she brushed aside a lot of these questions having to deal with the issue of governance and whether or not she'd be independent by saying, let's stop crimes. Kash Patel, over and over again, said he kept using rapes, the rise in rapes as an example, that as FBI director, he wanted to attack that. At the same time, Patel talked about recent polling that showed 40% of the American people support the FBI. Run down to its lowest level in years, in part because Republicans have attacked the Bureau relentlessly since the Trump investigations. But there's a difference between not liking the bureaucracy and not liking the FBI leadership and going after FBI agents who the public views as frontline cops. Big difference. Going after the bosses, fine. Going after the institution, which has had a checkered history since J. Edgar Hoover, okay. You start going after FBI agents like the head of the New York field office, who are decorated Marines, who have gone on raids, risking their lives, gun in hand, hostage rescues. You're talking about something else. This could be a political disaster for Trump. And the other thing about it is, as you start cutting body counts, as you start removing people from positions, example, as Ryan talked about, those January 6th prosecutors, a dozen of them were to be assigned to Superior Court in D.C. to deal with misdemeanor cases. And Trump ran, in part, on the crime wave in Washington, D.C. Yeah. So you're going from sort of going after institutions to going after cops on the street. And we haven't even talked about the pardon of all those people who committed violence against law enforcement. This is a very politically dangerous move for the president to be making.
I want to bring in NBC's Garrett Haake at the White House. NBC's Ryan Nobles is on Capitol Hill. Tim Miller is host of the Bulwark podcast and an MSNBC political analyst. And NBC's Christine Romans is with me to break down the broad impacts of the trade war. Welcome to all of you. All right, Garrett, what is the latest on all of this? And is there any chance we'll see the plans for other tariffs change in the next day or so?
I think it's entirely possible, Chris. The president is in the Oval Office talking to reporters as we speak, agreeing with at least the second part of that Wall Street Journal editorial, the idea that no country is fully safe from these tariffs. He says that negotiations will continue with Mexico, despite the fact that on Friday he said there was nothing any of these countries could do to avoid tariffs and that they were not a negotiating tactic at all. You mentioned Justin Trudeau, whom the president's spoken to once already this morning. He's got another call scheduled for around 3 o'clock this afternoon. And he's acknowledging, or at least he was last night when he returned from Florida, that this trade war or these tariffs will hurt American consumers, at least in the short term. Listen.
We may have short term some little pain, and people understand that. But long term, the United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world. We have deficits with almost every country. Not every country, but almost. And we're going to change it. It's been unfair.
Democrats have been seizing on those comments, suggesting that this is a broken campaign promise by a president who ran on lowering prices, enacting a policy here at the start of week 3, which can only lead to raise them. We'll see where these other negotiations go today, Chris, because it's clearly a live ball.
Well, I mean, look, I want to tell people that we got some notes from the pool. The folks are actually allowed to go into the Oval Office. It's a small group, and then they report back to us. So we got these bullet points. He said he has already talked to the Prime Minister, Trudeau, and that they had a great talk. But he says also, we haven't agreed on tariffs yet with Mexico. We're not well treated by Canada. Nobody is out of tariffs. Is there any level of confidence that folks out in the world who will be impacted like this know what's going on?
No, there shouldn't be. I mean, look, Chris, I covered the entirety of Donald Trump's campaign. There is nothing he likes more as a policy tool to solve any particular policy problem than the application of tariffs. If you pick your foreign policy issue, Donald Trump has a tariff that he thinks would be useful for it, or at least to threaten it. And I think that's the space we're in right now. In some cases, I think he believes there are trade issues, the sort of appropriate use, if you think tariffs could ever be appropriately used, with a country like China, for example. But his issues with Canada and certainly with Mexico don't really appear to be about trade at all. Remember, he negotiated a brand new trade agreement with those two countries in his first term. He's been talking about drugs coming over the border. He's been talking about migration. This is an attempt, I think, to use one tool at his unilateral disposal as President of the United States to shake out some results on a variety of different issues.
So, Christine, let me go to you, because the last point that we've heard from the pool so far, and again, as Garrett tells us, he's still in the Oval. He may still be taking questions. But Donald Trump said, we don't need Canadian cars, lumber, or agriculture. You have a lot of information about our trading partners and what they do and don't bring to the table. So help us out here.
Well, the National Association of Home Builders and other home building groups would say otherwise, that actually the U.S. does rely on a lot of those things right now, and putting taxes on them is going to make them more expensive. I mean, look at these three trading partners. These $1.2 trillion of goods the U.S. imported from these three countries just in the first 11 months of last year. That is a lot. That means all that stuff is going to cost more money to bring into the U.S. And you talk about Canadian oil. Yes, the U.S. is drilling more energy than it has ever done, breaking records. But it also is importing from Canada. It imports Canadian oil that then is refined in the U.S. and goes into American cars as gasoline. And experts say gasoline prices would increase 15 to 25 cents a gallon if that 10% tariff on Canadian oil goes into effect, as opposed to the 25% on everything else. So you talk about cars. President Donald Trump wrote the rules for how cars cross the border and then are sold in the U.S., right? What percentage of these cars can be assembled, or parts of them can be made in Canada and Mexico? He wrote those rules in the USMCA in his first administration. Now he wants to get rid of those rules and put tariffs on car parts. That will add $3,000 to the cost of new cars, experts tell us, because these parts cross borders over and over and over again. These are very intricate supply lines that basically this is a bomb going off in those supply lines. So one thing after another, there are worries you'll see higher prices. Mexico on pause for the week. So these are some of the goods from Mexico. All of this stuff comes from Canada. Did you know that 81% of frozen French fries come from Canada? I did not know that. But they have the...
Wait. French fries?
Yes. Now you're concerned.
Yes.
Your French fries here. And then technology. If you don't have carve-outs for some of these big tech companies that make their products in China, these tariffs in China will add to the cost of your goods. That's what the Consumer Tech Association says. So it's not whether prices will rise under a new tariff regime or trade war, Chris. It's how much. That's the debate we're having here.
Okay, so Tim, the criticisms came fast and furious once all of this got announced. But supporters will say, look, and you just heard this from Kristi Noem, it's working. Mexico is sending more troops to the border. Is this a win for Donald Trump, or is he just going to present it that way?
Well, I think that he's just going to present it that way. It's all about the PR for these guys. I noticed my governor, Jeff Landry, was there standing next to Kristi Noem. That's not in Louisiana. We've got a lot happening in Louisiana. We could use him here, I would think, instead of doing press conferences at the border. But look, this is just to demonstrate how much just PR this is, Chris. Like, on the one, just think about how incoherent this is. On the one hand, Trump says we need these tariffs, right? That the tariffs are necessary because we're getting getting taken advantage of. We want to build more stuff here in America. Yes. We don't want to import stuff from other countries. Like, we need it for economic reasons. But then the stock market goes down, and he says, oh, well, I've cut a deal with Mexico. They're going to put 10,000 troops at the border. But wait a minute. I thought the tariffs were needed for economic reasons. I thought we were being treated unfairly by Mexico on economics. Now you're telling me that just some troops at the border, which, by the way, Biden got 10,000 troops in the border in 2021. She sent troops to the border, or he did. The old president sent troops to the border in 2019 with Trump. So, like, the message is just incoherent. Trump is creating chaos and then taking credit on the back end. And that's what you're saying here.
Yeah, here's another thing, Tim. Well, this morning, the director of the National Economic Council said the media has it all wrong. This has nothing to do with trade, that it's 100% about the drug war. Problem is, when you're talking about Canada, the DEA says only, and I say this, only 43 pounds of fentanyl was seized at the northern border last year. That is a tiny fraction of what was seized at the Mexican border. And the reaction of Canadians has not been kind. Take a listen. Canadian sports fans booing our national anthem in Toronto. Same thing happened in Ottawa. What is it about Canada that has Donald Trump so upset?
Yeah, I mean, it's even more incoherent than you lay out, right? Like, they say it's about fentanyl, but barely any fentanyl comes across the border from Canada. So then why is he letting Mexico off the hook right now, where all the fentanyl is coming in, or most of it at least? A lot's coming in from ports as well. But then, at least for now, keeping the tariffs on Canada. That doesn't make any sense. J.D. Vance tweeted yesterday, I don't want to hear about the sob stories from Canada. Are they contributing enough to NATO? And it's like, well, wait a minute. This is about NATO contributions now? I thought it was about fentanyl. And but then the president is saying it's not about either of those things. It's about how we need the tariffs for economic purposes. Like, they're not even explaining it. It's completely incoherent, and it's causing, if he goes through with this, it's going to cause major disruptions in Canada. You know, our close trading partner, our ally, a country that sent troops to wars that we were participating in to stand with us, and we're going to do it for what? He can't even explain what it's for. Like, they change every minute why they're doing it. Like, it's just because he likes the chaos and the reality show of it all, and he thinks tariffs is a beautiful word.
Well, Donald Trump says, Garrett, that, again, I'm looking at the second set of notes that have come out of the Oval Office. He says they'll speak to China in the next 24 hours, probably. China won't be involved in the Panama Canal for long. China will be dealt with on the Panama Canal. Tariffs were just an opening salvo, and the tariffs will go up if we can't make a deal. There does seem, to your point, to, at least in his rhetoric, to be an awful lot of focus on getting this done.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. And again, I mean, we became familiar with this during the campaign. To Donald Trump, it's sort of like the adage of if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. He has, unilaterally, as president, a wide authority to implement and to threaten tariffs on adversaries and on allies alike. And he is using that across the spectrum of foreign policy issues to try to achieve a desired result. Now, on Friday, he was arguing publicly to reporters in the Oval Office in a setting much like the one that's happening right now, that was not his goal, that he was not trying to negotiate, and that he didn't want anything from these countries on whom he was placing tariffs. He has clearly shown that not to be the case. And so I think we just have to continue to look at all of these threats as threats until proven otherwise. He wants to try to keep lines of communication open, in some cases to appear to have the upper hand. Whether or not he does, it depends on the issue. And I think we're going to continue to see this play out, across the next 12 hours until the first deadline for Canada and China, and the next month for Mexico, if indeed that's where the deadline lands.